Welcome to Crossing the Chasm. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Paige Collings, who is a senior speech and privacy activist at EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. As a lawyer, digital policy activist, and community organizer, she works to dismantle systems of oppression and advance collective liberation. Paige focuses on highlighting how state surveillance and corporate restrictions stifle marginalized communities and perpetuate historic injustices and harm. She has worked with activists across the globe to facilitate systemic change by speaking truth to power and creating spaces for alternative imaginations for justice for all. Paige is a board member of the European Digital Rights Network. Paige holds a master's degree in law, a master's degree in political science, and a bachelor's degree in politics and history. And I have to say, this was a very interesting discussion. Paige is extremely knowledgeable, well-spoken, and has a beautiful vision for the future of our digital space, and it was a delight to talk to her. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Paige Collings, welcome to Crossing the Chasm.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Lovely to talk with you. And I want to begin by just starting with, can you speak to the chasm or chasms in society that relate to the work you're doing and your interests?
Absolutely. So I think we, within the field of digital rights and free expression and the right to privacy, which is the work that I do at the Electronic Frontier Foundation as senior speech and privacy activist, it's a pretty broad kind of scope, especially given that so much of the online space has become, the offline has become synonymous with the online. I think what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic at the height of that is that with so many of our conversations and engagements went online. So we were able to see our favorite bands perform online. We were able to communicate with our loved ones and friends and family in a moment where physical interactions were not possible. But at the same time, what we saw is the transition from offline to online in terms of government records and engaging really in real life. So we see so many cashless society developments now. We see so much of basic needs and fundamental engagements in the online. And in doing so, of course, it does bring an immediate chasm of those with the means to access the internet and those without. And I think that's probably one of the biggest divides that we're experiencing right now is in this society where so much requires access to the internet or access to a mobile device. We often forget, or in building out these legislations and developments, it's often forgotten that maybe one family might share a device, or, there's a lot of the world that don't have the same literacy around engaging online. There are not the protections in law or in legislation preventing companies or governments from accessing our most personal data, whether that's a picture of our family or an intimate picture that we've sent to our partner, or indeed whether it's medical records or history of getting reproductive services provided to us, or whether it's entering a clinic for transition, gender reassignment or transition. So in terms of where we're at with the digital space, I think it's become so big and so much an engagement of our daily lives that it's so heavily politicized. And what we're seeing now is that divide of those that are aware of what's happening, those that have access to understanding that and taking action, and those that, it's a very difficult world out there. People are struggling to kind of afford basic needs, housing, electricity, food. And so compounding that with the reality of how do we reconcile the lack of a comprehensive data privacy legislation to prevent my most intimate data being collected, sold and shared and consequently used against me is a whole different kind of dilemma that we're having to reconcile. And so where we're at is it's a big challenge, it's a big issue. And of course, with greater developments. We see, vastly improved technologies and so many new technologies developing every day. With that comes new challenges. And so that's probably one of the big divides. And then I think alongside that, we also have this increasing global element to it, which is that we have a few countries and a few companies, a few services, a few corporations really setting the agenda and setting the tone for the global state of affairs. And in doing so, it's eroding a lot of the agency and rights of communities around the world that might not have access to developing their own tools, or at least engaging in a way that can prioritize their needs and their identities at the forefront.
Thank you for that overview. There's a lot there. I want to come back in a moment to sort of the global corporate sphere. But before we do that, you mentioned a couple things. I feel like I'm not struggling. I'm doing pretty well. I'm educated. And I don't have any idea about the digital space, about surveillance, about data. What do you say about that? I mean, how is it that we use this all the time and don't know very much about it?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And something that at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and similar kind of nonprofits and the work that we're doing, we're always trying to bridge that divide between having access to our devices and even, when we go online, and I'm based in Europe, so we have, for example, the GDPR. When you go online and you have to accept cookies, or you have to do these things where data engagement, when you go on a service and you accept all, when you go onto a social media platform and there's an update and you just accept all the development, all of these things, it feels very oppressive. And I think in society, a lot of these systems do, right? I think when we talk about changing political systems and engaging with these massive world problems, they can feel very beyond what we can really understand as individuals. And that's okay, because they are big and they are complex. But at the same time, we can do things about it. And it's all about breaking this down into kind of bite-sized chunks of what can I do? What am I interested in? What's really going to impact and affect me? And that's something that we're always trying to do, to work with community groups, work with grassroots organizations, work with impacted folks to educate and also ensure that people are equipped with information and knowledge to, at the very least, take a stand when they feel like incidents of injustice are happening. But it's very difficult. And of course, when we're in a situation where it can feel so heady, when you've got governments and corporations kind of working together to censor speech online or to collect your data and sell your data, I think that's when it can really feel like, when you do learn about it, it just feels so beyond your control that the immediate reaction there is like, I'm too stressed anyway, so I'm just going to opt out.
So can you speak to this issue about surveillance? Because some people would argue you're online, you have to just assume that all of your information is going to be available and taken by corporations. So is that, what's wrong with that statement and that sort of sentiment?
Yeah, I think, and it really touches upon the idea of being offline as well with surveillance, where you've got face recognition cameras when you enter a baseball game or a basketball game in the US, for example, or when in the UK you're going to a football match, a soccer match, and they're deploying face recognition. And the idea that actually I've got nothing to hide, so what's the problem? If it's to catch some criminals or to do that, I'm okay. I'll take the hit because nothing will impact me. And I think there are lots of, it's an understandable approach of just, okay, well, I don't really understand what this camera is doing. Is it not the same as CCTV? Or, well, I'm not really doing anything online anyway, so you can track me, you can surveil me. It's not a big issue. And I think that there's the moral argument there, which is that the data that's being collected is so private, right? We're not just talking about your social media posts that are public. We're talking about intimate messages, information that you're choosing to share. And I think bringing it down to a personal level of like, if you've been given a good piece of news or contrarily a really bad piece of news, perhaps from the doctor or from your employer, you want to be able to decide who to communicate that with and when and how. You want to speak to your partner, to your parents, to your family or your friends. You want to control the environment upon which that's shared. and contained within, and you want to be able to nurture that and do it in a way that builds the trust. Essentially, fundamentally, we want to be able to decide when to share information and how, and we are able to do that often, except when we're in the online space. What we have to understand in some of these methods of surveillance is that without the right to end-to-end encryption or without the right to serious protections of our privacy, which guardrails this, we've got governments, we've got corporations snooping on every message. And so we wouldn't want to tell our partner that, we've had a really serious medical diagnosis or that you've lost your job, and then have that broadcast around the world and have the government, have your prime minister or your president know that, and not only know that, but then weaponize that information against you by selling that data or, surveilling it, censoring it, sharing that, in the future, we want to be able to control that. And I think that's really what we're talking about here. When we talk about face recognition, we want to be able to determine when our faces are being used and what databases are being used there. I think rather than just accepting this pretty sinister approach of like, well, I've got nothing to hide, because ultimately it's not about what we've got to hide, because everything can be used against us. And even if you feel like you don't have anything to hide, the data that's being collected is being collected and pumped into an ecosystem that is detrimental to the lives of so many people. So there's that egalitarian approach of like, well, if you might think right now you've got nothing to hide, maybe in the future you will, maybe in the future you won't, but you can be on one of these databases anyway, or this data could be used against you. And then also when we talk about our devices, we've got confidential information on there that we will want to keep to ourselves or to the people that we've shared it with, and not have the employees at Facebook reading it, for example. And so I think in that regard, it's really about recognizing that we have this agency, and we do make these determinations every day of, I don't want to just broadcast this piece of information as a tweet or as a post. I want to share it with my best friend. Well, I'm not going to stand on the street and broadcast that. And so that's really what we're talking about here. We make these decisions every day on what to share and how. And there should therefore be no difference when we enter the online space, especially when we consider that once that information is shared, without these protections on speech and privacy, it's going to be collected, it's going to be sold into the kind of the ecosystem of data surveillance and consequently used, whether directly against you or in society in the future. And so it's about recognizing that we do already make these decisions every day, but in the online space, we need to make sure that we have agency to continue being able to do so.
And your argument is that we don't have agency and that people don't know what they're getting into. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. So I think, and depending on what country we're talking about here, right? The US does not have a comprehensive data privacy legislation. In the European Union, there is the GDPR GDPR regulation. So that has a protection there. There are specific ones in certain countries elsewhere. We can look at Australia or whatever. But so it depends on what we're talking about here, specifically contingent on the surveillance. If we look to the US, there is no comprehensive federal data privacy legislation. So in lieu of that, we don't have these comprehensive protections on when data is collected, what data is collected, and then individual recourse for that. So what we can do is look to state levels, like the state of California and different states around the US have protections for privacy. So for the sale or collection of data, both online and offline. And when I say offline, I'm talking about, for example, the collection of data for face recognition purposes, for example, automated license plate reader, the collection of data that cars may take. So many devices now are connected to the internet. We have fridges that are connected to the internet, vacuum cleaners, cars. We're not just talking about mobile devices anymore. And in doing so, anything that's connected to the internet can collect your personal data. So when we see Roombas, the vacuums that move around the house, or Ring doorbells, like these are collecting data and then selling the makeup of your internal house, or selling your drive patterns. So there's all of this stuff that's being sold and collected and sold, and it's about recognizing what can I do as an individual. So what you can do is enable end-to-end encryption on all devices, which means that only you and the recipient will receive that. It's about making decisions on which technology you want to opt into. So when you're talking about, some of my colleagues have done fantastic work on children's tablets. So when we're talking about children's tablets, is every single swipe and click being collected, or are there better protection? Are there better devices that are protecting kids when we're talking about using VPNs, if you need to access confidential information and maybe you're in a state where gender affirming care is illegal or there are implications on reproductive rights. So figuring out which browser to use rather than communicating perhaps through an app or a messaging service that doesn't have end-to-end encryption, and therefore the data is that message is being collected, right? It's being surveilled, it's being monitored. So really making those individual decisions on what is the threat that I might face through this communication or through this situation, and how can I kind of make an individual assessment to mitigate that in the future. And so there are definitely ways that as individuals we can do that, and as organizations like the EFF that we're trying to both build out protections like Privacy Badger and HTTPS Everywhere, which are very easy plugins for devices and browsers to stop the tracking, but also working with governments and doing litigation to ensure that we can try and have a bigger, more federal or at least state level approach to protecting people's most intimate information.
So you are in another country at the moment. We're recording on different continents. And I have to say, I was a little bit nervous about which app to suggest to use because I didn't know necessarily what was the best. And so this raises this question again that you were just talking about. On the one hand, we can take individual actions and do our due diligence and figure out what app should be the most appropriate to limit surveillance. On the other hand, it would be nice just to live in a world where we didn't have all this surveillance. So there's this tension between personal action versus really a systemic intervention by global actors so that we don't have to deal with this. So where are we in that, and where do you see this playing out in the long run? Is it going to be individuals having to figure it out, or do you think we're going to have interventions where we don't have to worry about it as individuals because it'll be taken care of at the state level?
I think the goal is both. So we never want to be able to rely. Well, I think the goal is always that we would have individual agency over every decision, and that the state cannot mandate certain things, right? Because that can always change. And what we see with many bills is that, especially in the US, they might get reversed or they can have a kind of protracted impact. So we always want individuals to be able to make the decision that works best for themselves. And that's why innovation and competition are so important, that there aren't guardrails over specific technology. So what we don't want is one regulation of, one app that can be the sole app, right? Because that restricts creativity, it restricts competition, it restricts innovation, and it ultimately buys into the same ecosystem that even if there's just one, it doesn't mean that it's always going to be the best. So what we want are choices, we want options. And I guess that's why organizations like ours exist, the EFF, is that we want to be able to take on that lift, that kind of work of trying to, as you mentioned, there's that tension between individual actions, so deciding which app to use, and then also regulating those apps themselves and ensuring that they're compliant or they're at least introducing an option to have end-to-end encryption. So that's something we've seen with Facebook Messenger is you can opt into to end-to-end encrypted chats, which is called a secret message on that platform. Or if you use Signal, which has, Signal is kind of certified to courts that it only that has very heavy end-to-end encryption, the code has never been broken, and it only, they've maintained that only timestamps of when each account is created and the date that it was connected are the only data that they collect. So if you can make those decisions yourself, but I think what we also need to remember when we talk about this is the amount of privilege that goes into making this decision anyway. And that's why we need to make sure that, the ultimate goal is that all these platforms and all these messaging services have at least end-to-end encryption as a default. And then people can still make that decision, because we talk about Signal, and Signal is it's a fantastic app. But it's not, if you go to a different country, maybe other countries aren't so aware of it, or, there are lots of countries where people don't have access to data, like mobile data, but the government might connect the telecommunication to have a deal with telecommunications to provide WhatsApp. And so it's about making sure that with WhatsApp, there's end-to-end encryption and compliance there. So it's not as easy as just always saying, choose Signal, because we know that around the world, it's not always going to be an option to, or at least an active ability to just choose Signal. But so it's about recognizing which apps are being used and are there end-to-end, do they have end-to-end encryption by default? And if not, then we can try and figure out how to advocate for that introduction.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I want to ask you a little bit about this issue of equity. And you've already mentioned a few things in terms of access. You've talked about different countries having different sort of protocols and the extent to which individuals have personal agency. How else should we think about this? What are the equity issues? How are marginalized communities taken advantage of more so than more affluent people, for example, in this digital space, in this surveillance context?
Yeah, and this is a lot of the work that I kind of undertake, because I think when we talk about this, all of these kind of conversations come with the big privilege, as I mentioned at the beginning, that people have the headspace to even just think about it and talk about it. A lot of people in this world are really struggling with just fulfilling their basic needs, and so to have a conversation about the ecosystem of data privacy, or ad surveillance, or police brutality in the form of digital rights, it's a lot and it feels heavy. And when we can frame it and we can ground it in the US, or we can, and even then it's difficult, right? Because when we talk about data privacy, the data that's being collected, or when we look at the most cheaper devices, so devices that are not as expensive as the cheaper mobile devices or computer devices, often they come with pre-installed applications that maybe are problematic. Or when we talk about people who've had their data collected in a, in kind of one of these leaks, it's like, what are the opportunities for people to obtain legal recourse or accountability? And every time it's like those that have got the time and the money to do so. And the more data that's collected it's from marginalized communities. It's from, when we look at, I've mentioned it a few times, but people seeking trans-affirming care or reproductive justice. We're talking about Black and Brown communities that are massively impacted by data surveillance. So we can also look at elder communities that are and seniors that are impacted by targeted advertisements and the impact of that. So just as in the offline world, there are these oppressive systems of inequality, it does translate to the online world too, except it's probably exacerbated because the reach is so much higher. And then when we leave the US or we leave Europe as a frame, we look at those that are seeking migration and asylum, and we can look at the European border in Greece, for example, which is one of, if not the most deadly borders in the world. And we look at the surveillance technology there. We look at the surveillance technology on the US-Mexico border. This is really high-tech, oppressive, violent technologies that are being used to surveil the most vulnerable communities, those that are seeking asylum. And when we break it down even further, we're looking at Black and Brown communities. We're looking at Black and Brown women. We're looking at Black and Brown women who are sex workers. We at each stage, more and more people, the more vulnerable people become, the less access to recognizing what's happening, and also recourse, because they're in such a vulnerable position, or they're so marginalized in many other ways. So when we talk about data, and we talk about digital rights, it's really important that we recognize that it's often those that have the least amount of access that are impacted the most. And that's just because there's not that ability to, as we're having these, have these conversations, make informed decisions. We often make the assumption that there's one device per person, but there are some households that have one device per household, right? And so how can we make sure that if there's somebody in that household that needs to that wants to access perhaps an application, a gay dating application, for example, that doesn't come back to them? Or, there are just all these different ways that we need to critique our own bias when we talk about technologies, and make sure that we are always platforming those with the least amount of access, but that are often the most impacted by the harms of technology in the way that it's being deployed.
I feel like the issue of surveillance and what you're talking about is not well understood, and even less understood is the kind of racial inequality, gender inequality that you're talking about. Are these issues that you're focusing on resonant with people, with governments, with activists? Is this something that's getting more attention, or is it, my perception is, it's not getting a lot of attention? How do you see it?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, I think, just because it's so big and it incorporates so many, it's a really pretty nefarious ecosystem, right? Like, we've got private companies harvesting and monetizing our data. These databases of corporations are pretty vast. Companies use this to reach kind of decisions about us, and governments not only allow it to happen, but often exacerbate that by enabling it, purchasing the data, and using it to downstream a bunch of inequalities. So I think if we take that approach, it looks very big, and it's not, we can say it's not very well received because it's extraordinarily profitable. Governments make money, corporations are making so much money on our most private information. So of course, there's not really an incentive there to change that. Even if we look at like social media platforms, right? The goal of them is to make money. And when you have such a profit ecosystem, or where the goal is just to make money and the most hostile, harmful content is what makes the most money, what's the incentive? There is no incentive there to make sure that these platforms are, I don't necessarily want to say safe, but at least not full of vitriol and hatred and hate speech and violent content, because that's actually what makes the most money for them. And so when we're in this place where at the core, data surveillance is making these corporations so much money, it's of course not so well received. It's contrary to that kind of capitalist ecosystem, essentially. So it's really just about breaking it down, and because it is so big, right? But I think, notwithstanding that, there are always access points and there are always entry points to working with corporations, working with governments to analyze. And there are legislations, both national level, internationally, that require corporations and governments to behave in a certain way that they've signed up to, that they are trying to comply with. And so it's not that we're lost in this like really vast ecosystem, but when we talk about all of this sensitive information that's up for sale, it is we can track the journey from somebody using an application on their phone to not getting a job opportunity or not getting housing or being denied bail. And that is the pathway, right? And it includes so many different actors and entities and agencies that at each stage there's just so much money being made. But yeah, it's about breaking that down and trying to find the entry points. And there is always an entry point. And we've found that over the years of EFF, but also in lots of other organizations that are doing this work and doing litigation, is that there's always an opportunity to hold not only the governments accountable, but the corporations as well.
So I want to get into that in just a moment and speak to the ways forward and what you see as pathways for overcoming some of these challenges. Before we do that, though, I'd really love to hear a little bit about how you came to be so interested in this topic and sort of your journey to thinking really carefully about digital freedom and democracy. Yeah,
so it's always been something that's been interesting to me. Prior to working at the EFF, I was working in a different kind of nonprofit on free speech and creative expression. So having that understanding of who are the arbiters of our speech online or offline as well, who is kind of dictating what is acceptable is a big deal. And I think coming from a number of different marginalized communities myself, it's something that has never been an active choice as much as just a recognition of how I am forced to maneuver through the world. And so knowing that and recognizing that has always been at the kind of the forefront of the work that I do, which is that I'm inherently impacted by surveillance as like a queer Black person. Entering this with EFF, I think, has been something that I wanted to kind of engage a bit more, especially the legal and litigation and kind of legislative angle of how can we drain the reservoirs of data? How by limiting what businesses collect? How can we prevent governments from undertaking such violent, hostile measures against the most vulnerable communities in our societies? So I think driven by this, I guess, egalitarian, utopian approach of like wanting to facilitate change, speak truth to power, make sure that those that are most marginalized, including the communities that I'm part of, not only have a seat at the table, but build our own tables, build our own spaces, and make sure that not just steamrolled into a situation, and that we have collective liberation throughout that. So I think and as I mentioned at the beginning, during COVID, it was just such a proliferation of digital space, activities on the digital space, that it really just highlighted how important it was going to be to prioritize and focus kind of in on that the rights that we have online, and how the online space was kind of being built by a number of actors in a way that was so restrictive to like the majority of the world. And that kind of got me agitated and frustrated.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate that. And I really was interested in talking to you in part because I saw on a website that you had used this term or this phrase, creating spaces for alternative imaginations. And you just sort of spoke to that a bit in your answer, but can you say more about what you mean by creative spaces for alternative imaginations?
Yeah, and I think it's always the goal for the work that I'm doing is not just, I think it can be really easy to kind of fall back into being a very reactionary, so we don't like this, or I don't like the ecosystem of data surveillance, I don't like ad targeting, I don't like Facebook's business, Meta's business model. But it's about, okay, we can work to make sure that these platforms are better and have better protections, all of these kind of things. But at the same time, it's like, what do we actually want? When we've got the space to sit and think about what we would like to see in this world, how can we make that happen? What do we need to do? And so really working with communities, working with people, working with different spaces, trying to really erode a lot of the systems, like, the colonial systems that we're working within when it comes to financing technology, when it comes to deploying technologies, when it comes to building out our own spaces. How can we erode those and build our own? What does it look like when we think about what kind of social media platform we would like to exist within? What does it look like when we want to host a conference on talking about data, but we want only people there that, really, really looking at those spaces. And I'm doing quite a lot of work right now with some incredible people across sub-Saharan Africa on a lot of the anti-LGBTQI bills that are passing in the continent. And one of the works that we're doing as part of a coalition is like, okay, so we're talking about this, but what do we actually want to see? If we were able to build a platform, if we were able to make sure that it was protecting our data, it had end-to-end encryption, it was safe for queer people to access, it had maybe a false front. So if you are going on there and your phone gets stolen from you, or you're sharing a device and it's illegal to be gay in that country, you're not outed and imprisoned, right? Like, when we talk about this, what does it really look like? And then trying to make that happen, essentially. And doing that with those that really need it. So, as I mentioned, not just making sure that we have a seat at the table, but building entire new rooms, new spaces, whilst also making sure that the seats at the table are provided, or at least we will bring a chair.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you're linking this sort of notion of digital democracy and surveillance with all of these practical issues that people care about. I guess, one of the visions for the internet was that it's going to be this amazing space where anybody can use it and it's going to be free and open and so forth. And it's been commandeered by corporations and tech companies and billionaires and so forth. Can you speak to some specific examples where we're breaking away from that, or where there are these spaces that really are democratic, that are being used for forwarding civil rights and human flourishing? Are there examples that you can point to that speak to this?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of the work that when we look at the work that we do in EFF, for example, there are so many of my colleagues that are working to build new tools, for example. So how can we build new tools to ensure that people are protected online? Or how can we build new systems to make sure that we're safe, or that people's needs are being met? And at the core of this is making sure people are included, right? I think if you have the same spaces over and over, you're going to get the same solutions over and over. And that's what we've had for so long, and not just in digital rights, but in all human rights spaces. It's often the same people funded by the same governments and foundations, and it's really about making sure that we bring in community groups, we bring in people who've already got these ideas and often maybe don't have access to really developing those or understanding those, or, for EFF having that tech influence. And there's a lot of influence out there, right? Like, we can look at the climate justice community who do so much incredible work on, you asked earlier about how can we make sure that people know more about surveillance. And it's like the climate justice community do so much incredible public outreach and in talking about the issues that they're working on. And we can also look to sex worker communities who do some phenomenal engagement with their own communities, and like, okay, what would a platform look like for us? How would soliciting online look for us? Like, what do we need to make sure that we would feel safe and also be able to have a platform for us? And so breaking it down to what do people need when we talk about ad targeting. Everybody's threat model is different, and people are already doing this work. We saw that after Roe v. Wade was overturned, is that there are already pro-justice groups doing so much work, and then we can enter as EFF and as tech experts to really enhance that and support the work. Because a lot of the times we see that this is already happening, or at least there's already conversations going, but it can be access to the specific terminology or to spaces or to resources. So really deconstructing those and supporting groups and really enhancing that with our technological knowledge, because that's where we can come in as EFF, as individuals who kind of know how this stuff works. We can really come in and enter with that expertise, and I think that's quite invaluable too.
Is there anything going on around boycotts or people coming together to use their collective voices to change anything? Is there any agency around that, do you think?
Yeah, again, I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think what's important here is that what's beneficial for one community is not for another. And so I think we would never say boycott something because we recognize that it might still be important for some communities. So when we talk about decentralized platforms, for example, there's a great, like an immense benefit to decentralized social media platforms. We look at services like Mastodon, Blue Sky is recently fully interoperable, I think. All of these services that allow people to build their own platforms, to, have significantly more agency than they would on services like X. But in terms of, I'm not going to go into the negatives of X right now, but what is also true is that it is still being used as a platform by many people around the world to connect with their communities. And so whilst it's beneficial to some that the whole platform would be banned and we could call for a boycott, it wouldn't reflect the global situation because there are still some people using it, right? And they can turn to Mastodon and Blue Sky, but maybe one, it's not available in their country, or people don't have access to it. They don't have space on their mobile device because they've got a phone with a small storage, and there's no cloud service, or maybe, there are so many implications that when we talk about something, it's really important to incorporate as much nuance as possible. There are some things that are a little bit more black and white, right? Like there are some legislations that were like, this needs to end. Like we fundamentally want to see the end of this piece of legislation, or we really, at the core, like this is a non-negotiable, right? Like we do not like that's something that there are certain things we don't like, cops running DNA manufactured faces through face recognition. Like we want to see an end, like a ban to government use of face recognition. So there are some things that are pretty black and white or without nuance. But in terms of boycotting services, boycotting platforms, I think it's a bit more nuanced depending on which community is calling for that. And we would just we would like the platform more because that's the importance of innovation. What we want are technologies that at their core have a privacy-first approach, and then people are able to kind of choose their own adventure depending on what they would like to experience the best version of the internet for themselves.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. That nuanced perspective is fantastic. I guess that leads to an obvious question then. Listeners are interested in what you're saying. They're persuaded. What should they do? What do you tell people? What should they do either in their personal lives or in terms of supporting coalitions or legislation? What do you tell people to do? Where can they go? Where can they get information from?
Yeah, so you can. Information is always. We have a lot of information on our website, EFF.org, and you can find out so much stuff on there. There's pretty much everything that we work on will be on our website. You can find information on the current, we're updating website, I think, pretty much daily on. There are more than 100 people, writing about current affairs, current topics. So you can find a lot of information there. In terms of just daily life and daily existence, if you hear about all of this and you're thinking, okay, I understand that I can maybe do something in my life to make things a bit easier, or to just learn a bit more about how to protect myself, we have a fantastic resource called Surveillance Self-Defense. That's ssd.eff.org. And that's a vast resource of how-to guides, so how to use Signal, what are guides, so like what is encryption, what is end-to-end encryption, and what you can do there is you can build a threat model. So you can you can understand what your threat model is. So if you're, for example, a sex worker and you need certain protections, or you are seeking reproductive justice or trans affirming care, and you would like to know how to communicate that. If you are just wanting to figure out how better to engage online, so you're learning about all of these things, and you're like, okay, I don't actually want my data being collected online. I know it's a big thing, but what can I do in the meantime? What browser should I use? What plugins should I download? You can find all of that on Surveillance Self-Defense, so ssd.eff.org. If you want to get involved in a bit more action, you can visit our action center, act.eff.org, so act.eff.org, and you can go there and you can sign campaigns, you can sign petitions, you can get involved in a bit more direct action there, and also learn about kind of what we're doing when we're telling Congress about bills like COSA or ProCode, things like this. You can sign petitions there. But what I also would suggest is that we've got the Electronic Frontier Alliance. Now, if you want to get a bit more involved in some community groups or campus organizations, this is a great place to go, because we've got many within this network, the EFA. So you can go there and you can join the EFA, you can find allies, you can really figure out kind of what's happening in your community. So you can go there and you can see kind of which groups may be in your region, which groups might be around, and if you're interested in learning a bit more and getting involved, you can do that. So that's, I think, EFF.org/Electronic Frontier Alliance, or you can just type in Electronic Frontier Alliance. And that's across the US, and it's broken down into different regions, so like Western, Central, Eastern, I guess. So that's also quite a good way to figure out kind of if you're interested in privacy, or there are privacy labs on there, there are community groups, there are lots and lots of different situations that bring it down a bit more to the community level. That's also a good place to go. So I think overall there are lots of different spaces to go to. But I think the main thing is if you would like to get involved in much more direct action, is to find those local groups, to see what they're doing, to find your community. I think that's really important. A lot of this is really overwhelming and stressful, and beyond visiting our website and signing petitions, engaging in direct action, it's also about figuring out your community. So if you're really into if you're a sex worker and you want to learn a bit more, you can visit Hacking Hustling, for example, and they're a fantastic community doing a lot of work for sex worker rights online. So really just finding your community. If you're, an elder person who wants to do something, you can join Raging Grannies Action League, and you can join that community who are doing a lot of work in that. So it's really just about trying to figure out what your community is, what kind of privacy you want to advance, what speech you're frustrated in. If you're really frustrated in the censorship of pro-Palestinian content online, there's lots of community groups working on that, or there are lots of organizations and groups working on that. So really figuring out what kind of gets you going, and focusing on that, 'cause I think that's probably the most sustainable approach, because otherwise it can get very overwhelming pretty quickly.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for providing that insight and those opportunities, which will be very helpful for people. I want to end with 3 questions that are more personal. And the first one is either related to or beyond the work you're doing personally. What do you see in society that gives you inspiration and energy?
I think it's that when we look throughout history, there've been so many attempts. What we're seeing right now online is not new, right? It's just online. It's an online dimension of ecosystems and structures that have existed offline for hundreds of forever. There's inequality, there's oppression. These things are not new. It's just that they just have a bigger reach now because they're able to, because they're online. rather than restricting the speech of 10 people in a town square, you can now restrict the speech of 1 million people because it's on Twitter. Recognizing that people have resisted this throughout history. There have always been attempts to silence, particularly the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. And at every stage, people have resisted that. And we've been able to, through collective liberation, through community work, through taking a stand, through revolutionary activities, by speaking truth to power, we've been able to resist that. People have done absolutely phenomenal work. And so it's now our turn to kind of take that stand and step in and use what we can, use the authority and the kind of the truth that we know to resist this. And so knowing that we're not alone and we've never been alone, we've got ancestors guiding us. There's a wealth of history behind us that has that we can tap into. Really looking at the carceral level of a lot of these ecosystems are being built on the carceral state. For me, a lot of this work is grounded in the belief of abolition. That's something, again, that gives it a much bigger impact, and it threads it throughout history. Really leveraging the work of so many key and foundational abolitionists in the work of like recognizing that why is data being collected? It's to silence people, and make money. And so recognizing that angle is something that, on a very personal level, very much speaking on a personal level, that's something that drives me forward. I think they're probably the main things that I'm fundamentally driven by, is that we've always been able to resist this, and it's a much bigger ideological dilemma than just ad targeting online, right? It's grounded in something much bigger.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. The second question is there anything that you've read or heard or listened to recently that has made you think in new ways or more deeply about your work or the current moment in our society?
Nothing is coming to mind. And the reason nothing is coming to mind is because I'm reading a lot. I think, so a text that I'm always coming back to, actually, is this idea, a lot of just to pick on what I was mentioning about, a lot of the key abolitionist texts of where do we want to be, kind of what's the society that we want to build. And I think a lot of the texts of like people like Audrey Lorde, I fall back on that a lot. There's no such thing, when she's talking about things like there's no such thing as a single issue struggle or because nobody lives a single issue life. All of these things are interconnected, and we have to recognize that there's no, we can't just isolate these struggles. We can't isolate people because they're not. So I think that's probably something I always come back to, other works of people like Audrey Lorde. Also that, the very famous, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I think you asked me earlier about what I feel about reimagining new futures. It's that we can't just use the same tools that are used to oppress us. We have to build our own, and we have to be able to provide spaces to do that. So yeah, it's not something that I've read recently, but it's something that her work is something that I always come back to, especially those two ideas that like, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle. It's important to make sure that we're leveraging and recognizing all of the nuances, and also that, we must also find space and time to build new space, build new things, use new techniques and methods, because we can't just perpetuate the same harms that are being caused against us. We must build new spaces for liberation.
Well, that makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then the last question is, you're working amongst all these challenges and so forth. What gives you a sense of peace and joy?
I default to the arts a lot, actually. I think, again, to touch upon what I answered as the first question, is that in the face of so much oppression and inequality, this is not new, and people have been here before. So sadly, that it's just that it's kind of this new iteration that we're in right now. And in the face of all of that, there is just so much good literature, great art that's always been produced. People have always been able to find joy in whichever way that works for them, whether it's writing, whether it's reading, whether it's producing music. I think we can look at the jazz scene as such a good indication of that. So I default to the arts all the time. I think that provides a lot of joy. And also knowing that in the face of so much oppression, that's also something that people have always defaulted to. And you can really feel that, I think, in a lot of music, in the face of kind of censorship and stuff like that. People will always find a way to communicate with one another, and that's why we need to uphold the internet as a central point and a vehicle for communication at all costs.
Well, Paige Collings, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to speak with you.
What a wonderful conversation. I so enjoyed talking to Paige and so appreciated the way she brought a nuanced, thoughtful perspective to this situation around digital space and surveillance, and especially the focus she has on marginalized communities. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. As always, I want to thank the executive producers of Crossing the Chasm, Dan Phillips and Cody Bayless. I want to thank Anodyne Diversion for the music. And as always, I want to thank you for listening in. Thanks so much, and I hope you can tune in again next time.